Well, you're recording already. We barely started.
Hi, and you're right on time too. Thank you.
Well, of course I am.
Hello, Daniel
I,
Ellenberg.
I have two totally compulsive parents who look very dangerous to be a minute late. So I learned
Dangerous. May I ask what the consequences were?
just being pissed off.
I see.
Where are you located, Jarod?
I am contacting you from Nashville, Tennessee.
Were you there during the flood like 11, 12 years ago?
No, I was not.
City flooded, the Omni Hotel flooded. I was there.
You were there when it happened.
I was. I escaped at the last moment. All right. Well, that's good that you kind of match your bed.
You approve.
I approve. It's very important to me that people match their beds, for sure.
I do what I can. Thank you so much for spending some time with me this morning.
Sure. You came to me through Chris Germer, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay.
And I approached Chris because of my interest in the subject of anger. And actually, the more research I've done into all of your work and ambition and efforts, it seems like you've had similar interests and passions in trying to curb so much of what could easily be termed toxic masculinity in this day and age. But I actually appreciate the term masculine identities, but restrictive masculinities, touched by the emphasis on achievement and how so many men often feel as though they have no validation or worth unless they have a certain amount of success, a certain amount of wealth, a certain amount of clout. There was also the emphasis on emotional control, which I know so many men try to impart on relationships because of their own insecurities. The sense of anti-femininity and homophobia. I would love to hear more, particularly about your experience dealing with couples and perhaps the only relationships in your own life, because I find relationships to be such, I would call them a trigger, but a consistent opportunity for confrontation, for conflict, for disagreement.
Well, let's spend a few minutes talking about what the purpose of anger is. And so I find it useful to look at it from an evolutionary survival perspective. And so if we do some reverse engineering and look at anger, or look at any emotion really, that it has some survival purpose. Oftentimes it's distorted, but that, like, what's the core of what that's about? And according to evolutionary psychologists, when we're really looking at it, that anger exists to help us protect our boundaries, that the experience is that someone has stepped over, stepped into, stepped through our kind of human boundaries. Now, of course, that's perceptual. Like someone, you can be walking down the street and somehow make eye contact with someone and go, "Ah," like this, because they have the experience that you have stepped over their boundaries when they're actually, don't have very good ones. And so they have a defensive reaction to that. But I think that it's important to not batify anger. That for starters, there's a way that anger itself can be shamed. And I think a lot of guys get shamed, for being angry. But really anger is kind of can get mixed with a whole bunch of different other experiences, like even playfulness. Like I see with guys a lot of times they'll be kind of play banter, and it's going up well until somebody has the experience that the other person has incurred on their boundaries. They try to dominate them, they try to make them humiliate them in some way, and then they get angry, and then the play could even potentially turn violent. So this is a not exactly a fairly common dynamic, but and the violence itself is very rare, but certainly the reactivity is common. And so at the core underlying, I think anger is a sense of reaction to threat.
Mm-hmm.
And as human animals, we are wired safety versus threat, friend versus foe. So anger has a incredibly important value in terms of self-preservation, in terms of safety. So problem is we're often not very wise at being able to discern an actual threat from an imagined one. And that's part of the either the bug in the system or a design flaw, in the human brain. And so what is it that gives rise, to anger? It's often an experience that one's self-concept, has been jarred in some way. That someone, for example, hasn't returned an email. And it's like, well, who does that person think they are? They think that I'm nothing or I'm not, I don't matter. And they get angry as a way of, on some level, inflating oneself, to be stronger than, or at least as tough as, which plays into some of the male stuff, versus going deeper into what actually happened. Aside from the fact that the person may not have seen the email, you may have missed the email. There's all kinds of things that could be wrong in terms of even the perception itself. But really, what's going on at a deeper level, and oftentimes, my experience is one of hurt, or some deeper insecurity, a way of equalizing, a way of establishing one's ground, to show one's significance, in this way, in a defensive kind of way. And so I think that a lot of times when we're dealing with the whole territory of anger, we're really talking about how do people defend themselves against perceived threats. And if we can really find a way to actually feel safer within ourselves, that in and of itself is going to mitigate the experience and expression of anger. Right? And now in terms of couples, that's where it comes out a lot, where if you're talking about heterosexual marriages, then between a man and a woman, when the guy feels somehow compromised in some way, somehow she's seeing him as less than, unhappy, triggered. Anger is a way of creating a certain ground and leveling or upscaling the field so that you feel the man feels his own strength and competence and capabilities there, when actually underneath it's like, ow, that hurt. I feel vulnerable. Am I okay? I don't think I'm okay. I don't really matter. I'm weak. I'm ashamed. I'm a loser. I'm not a loser. I'm going to turn myself, and so it can quickly turn into that. You may have had that experience yourself. Right? I think that's fairly common. And so the process of, to some degree, what we call emotional archaeology, in a sense of digging below the layers and say what's really going on in a vulnerable way, I think is the core of healing. But you have to be aware of that and be accepting that that's real. That vulnerability is a part of life. And guys will tend to try and deny that vulnerability, partly based on some of their male conditioning, that happens. And so it subverts guys from having a more direct relationship with themselves and hence others because they're trying to prove something. And oftentimes it's proving one's masculinity, one's vitality, one's viability, when actually, the better approach is to get more in touch with one's vulnerability without the shame, right? Because when vulnerability is tinged with shame, then that's a breeding ground, for reactivity. And how do we just accept the fact that there's, vulnerability? Like you think about in Buddhism, the heavenly messengers, old age, sickness, death. We're talking about hardwired vulnerabilities. And yet the pretense that we don't have those and the cultural, edicts that say, don't be vulnerable, just something profoundly wrong. And I don't mean from a moralistic perspective with that. There's something that's not human about it. And so when we look at marriages or just couples dynamics there, when a guy is supposed to not be vulnerable, and there are certainly women who believe that, it's not just male conditioning, it is cultural conditioning. And so we hear a lot about from women, like, I want a guy to show his vulnerabilities. I want a man who'll show his vulnerability. And yet, on a deep sub to unconscious level, they don't want that. Or at least a part of them doesn't want that. I'm sure that part of them really does want that. And I'm not talking about all women.
Sure.
But some women believe consciously that they want a guy to be more vulnerable. But when he does, they're like, what? And so I'm not saying this to criticize women. I'm saying this to, on some level, speak to some of the larger dynamics that I see. And in order for us to really transform ourselves as individuals and groups and a culture, we have to pay attention to what is. I'll pause there. You may have some other questions, but I'm sure I could say much more.
Oh, no, I agree entirely. And what I find interesting is that from my own perspective in my codependent tendencies, and also from men I've been close enough to speak frankly with, there's what I think Jordan Peterson refers to as kneeling toward the feminine. That a lot of men are coming from a standpoint or a basis of looking to women to validate them. So what is going to make me attractive? Tell me how I have worth. And despite the seeming benefits of a male-dominated society, you have the vast majority of violent crimes committed by men. There nevertheless is this continual disengagement and disillusionment. And what I find difficult, and I'm sure you've encountered this throughout your many practices and pursuits throughout your life, is trying to get men to be vulnerable, despite the fact that they might not even realize they're coming from the standpoint of looking to women for approval. So taking the risk of being vulnerable, despite the consequences of losing that approval, of not being as attractive, of not feeling as valuable, and how in your life and in your actions have you been able to open men up despite how terrifying that territory might be for them?
Well, I think it all begins at home. So for me, it's about owning, honoring, embracing my own vulnerabilities. So if I'm sitting in judgment and shame about my own vulnerabilities, good luck on supporting other men, to be vulnerable, because then it's not real. And so I try to really, walk my talk, to live through the lens of vulnerability. Now, am I successful all the time? Absolutely not. But I know that in my work with men, when they see me, being vulnerable, that in and of itself is a statement, and it's an affirmation, and it's a reinforcement for them to be. But let's just step back for a moment and say, what exactly is vulnerability, right? Because, on some level, I think we need to define our terms. Now, a lot of times people see vulnerability as weakness, and depending on the paradigm, it can be. So if you, for example, if you look at a very competitive paradigm, like sports, for example, sometimes in business, definitely in politics, what you do is you look to see who your opponent is and what are their vulnerabilities so you can exploit them. The NBA finals are happening right now, between the San Francisco Warriors, and the Boston Celtics. And you can be damn well sure that they're looking at what are the other team's vulnerabilities and how can we exploit them, just like in any type of competitive paradigm. But the problem is that there are many areas of life where it's not that paradigm, but we apply that paradigm, to it. And it happens with guys with each other, who's biggest, toughest, strongest, smartest, sexiest, richest kind of thing. And without kind of recognizing that that paradigm itself is set up in a win-lose kind of way, and it's not set up for connection. It's not set up for intimacy. And when I say intimacy, I don't mean sexuality per se. I mean it in terms of the phonetic of intimacy. So if you and I, Jarod, are seeing like, who's tougher, who's this, we're not going to connect, really. It's going to be like Do you think you're tougher than me? You think you are? I'm going to show you, kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
We don't get the real joy of having a relationship, right? So I think that being able to distinguish paradigms is hugely important. And I very rarely hear people talk about it, because when you apply one paradigm wrongly, you can get in trouble. The other thing is also true. The other way is also true, where you think, oh, we're friends, and the other person is actually trying to get over on you, on some level. So we have to, be aware. It doesn't mean, when I say to embrace your vulnerability, it doesn't mean exposing your soft underbelly to anyone at any time, for any reason, because, there are people who are not trustworthy. And each of us are not trustworthy in certain ways at certain times, depending on our mood. So it's super complex, in terms of this territory. So I actually see vulnerability as the core of creation. That when we start off with what's deepest, what's on some level most raw, and really embrace that and accept that, not shame that, but to be with that, then great things can happen from there. I oftentimes think about the paradox that the youngest part of us is also the oldest part of us. That little child in us has been around the longest. And when we really look even at brain formation, the experiences we had early in life get scaffolded early on, and they become part of how we function, how we focus unconsciously around safety versus threat, for starters, around connection, around enjoyment. And so to embrace that little being, in oneself, that little guy that you have, that I have, that every guy has, and have that be okay, and recognize that that's a part of the complexity of who we are. And I can say that for me, having really gotten deeper into accepting that little guy in me, it was like, I'm a professional. I'm going to be talking in front of these people. I don't want to. I want to go home to mom. And so I can be with that part of me that would pull me away from a larger sense of mission if I shame that. But if I say, you know what, in the complexity of who I am as a being, that is a part of me. It's a part of, like, the pie chart, so to speak. And to recognize that. And there's also, someone who's stronger, not necessarily stronger, but more adult, in there, who, has a sense of clarity and a sense of missions going forward. But to deny that, and to deny the vulnerability, really, of that little boy, is to immediately tighten and to armor up to protect against. And that's part of what leads into the reactivity, in and of itself. So how do we embrace that and accept that little being and recognize it's a part, it's not the whole. And I find that when we really start looking at the territory of complexity, meaning that we have multifaceted, multi-aspect being, it's a lot easier to be what I would call selves accepting rather than just self-accepting.
Absolutely. I remember a quote of yours where you were talking about viewing oneself as a system of selves as opposed to a single self. It becomes so tempting as we grow older to think, well, this is who I am. I'm a solid individual, as opposed to an amalgam, a smorgasbord of different personalities and wants and needs. And anger, to my mind, despite its utility, can often be, in my own life, a byproduct of something far deeper. Yes. And I've also heard you talk about anger being linked with deep sensitivity. So a desire to cover up something that's so raw, I don't wish to face it. And I would imagine that as we shut off, as you talk about the inner child, we're losing ever more touch with who we really are, how it's linked with all those other aspects of ourselves, which would probably only lead to more anger as a substitute.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the big differences between males and females from early on, and nursery school teachers and kindergarten teachers will tell you this, despite, however we're trying to make the sexes the same, is that boys just tend to be more aggressive. I remember when I had a son, which I still do, but he's almost 33 now. But when he was a little boy, he'd pick up sticks and slam them. And my wife would be so surprised because even though she taught developmental psychology, she grew up with a sister, and they're always kind of like daintier, in a way. With no judgment about that, but there are differences. And when boys get shamed, for that aggression, it actually leads them to become more angry. But how do we actually use the aggression in a way where we're not necessarily honoring it, but we're accepting, of that? And how do you work with that in a way where you can kind of use that aggression in the service of relationships, versus me-centrism, and egotism there, or just, actually having to turn violent. Shaming will always lead people to go underground. And when they go underground, dark things can happen. So I really look at this as how do you use that rather than going, okay, you shouldn't be aggressive. You should, like, that kind of, mentality versus like it's a part, right? A part, a person. It's not everything. And it's like, how do you, work with it, play with it, and actually have that aggression turn even potentially into something more playful that we can play, like use that. And I think that if you look at male mammals, be they, some deers, or chimps, they'll kind of ram against each other. Males will. Females aren't doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're ramming against each other, and on some level, potentially making each other stronger. And indeed, the word competition I find very interesting. The roots, the etymology of it, it comes from the Latin competere, which means to strive together. And you hear like athletes, when they're really in pure form in a certain way, they don't just want to win. They want a good competition because the competition itself makes them better.
Mm-hmm.
They use each other, to, exert their capabilities, their strengths to become stronger. And if we shame that, you shouldn't be competitive, you shouldn't, in that way, it somehow is not honoring a certain part of human nature. It doesn't mean like, okay, now you're going to turn into aggression and just try and kill the other person. But if we don't like bring out our, our shining armor, so to speak, and I shouldn't use the word armor, but our capabilities and, push against each other, sometimes we don't actually get to develop certain strengths.
Absolutely. It's interesting because anger, of course, can be so difficult to experience, and it can be such an immediate trigger to intense conflict. And so I would imagine that the temptation is often to curb it immediately. This anger needs to stop. It needs to stop now. And I think back to caveman times when the fight or flight was so much more useful, when there was more of a utility to trying to protect one's family, one's possessions, one's territory, and how, at least in my own experience, the intensity, the extreme of it, hasn't necessarily dissipated to match current cultural standards. I have felt such intense extremes come over my body to a situation that obviously wasn't do or die, fight or flight.
Right.
And it's due to, of course, the chemicals being released, the cortisol and the testosterone, and all the things that have served a man throughout evolution to keep us alive. But in current present-day society, it has been a cause for fear, shame, rejection, and also feelings of self-loathing.
Right.
And I appreciate your insight regarding that, because I feel that can be quite a toxic situation. So you have men who are experiencing all these conflicted feelings, but have no real idea of how to express them. And in current day society, they're being encouraged to do so, but often not told how and in what manner it's okay.
And they're shamed a lot.
Yep.
I mean, there's the whole idea of the pendulum. I think is really important in terms of how people and how cultures shift, which is oftentimes we go from one extreme to the other extreme. Men are on top of the world, they're all good, and there's a lot of shaming, about men, that is going on. And it's a very, very confusing time, in terms of gender. It's times that are, fueling political discord and this, to some degree, without becoming overly political here, you know, it's always like tender ground.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
To walk upon. But tender though it be, I will. I do see that, on the right side of the political spectrum these days, there's a way of like, men are good, men are, and then on the left side, there's some bigger challenges, like, maybe not so good, maybe too extreme. I don't think it's actually an equivalent, because I think the right is way more dangerous, when it comes to what's happening, but that's my own personal opinion there. But nonetheless, there's a lot of confusion, about what does it mean to be a man, what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be gender fluid. And my own personal bias is I think that we pay much too much attention to what's considered masculine and what's considered feminine. I don't think, for example, that as a man who is like in touch with my emotions, who can be moved, who can cry, does cry, I never feel like when I'm crying about something that I'm getting in touch with my feminine side. I mean, I think that's one of the worst branding, ideas for guys imaginable. Like, because, at core, I would say I'm a humanist, and I don't call myself a feminist. I believe in equality, equity. I believe in all those things, but I think the ways that it's going about these days, with all the vitriol and just the contentiousness and anger, frustration, is maybe part of the pendulum. But I think we have to come to a different kind of equilibrium there. And to me, I look at people as having the full spectrum of possibilities, from aggression to compassion, from a kind of core strength to vulnerabilities. That's all part of the human condition. And when we start calling something a masculine behavior and something a feminine behavior, which is really what sexual research, was originally really doing, is like health was designated a degree to which a boy and a man identified with the male sexual. As you mentioned some of those at the beginning, of our conversation, anti-feminine or strong dominant, things like that's masculine. Come on, seriously, that's human. And I don't think that we should be teaching people at all to be more masculine or feminine. I'd say, like, if that's your predilections, if that's how you're wired, just honor that wiring, and see, like, really be the best you can be and develop who you are. And so, like, the model I use, and I use this in my men's work and my affiliations with some, conglomerate of guys who are working in this, we call it strength with heart. Mm-hmm. That you can be strong, and heartful. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, it's much better when they're mutually inclusive. And so that means that you have the full spectrum available to you. And I see that for gender fluid and for, women, girls, women, that, you can be strong and heartful too. It may look different, and it looks different in each guy. I remember talking with someone whose son was a professional guitarist, and he could look like, more feminine, in what's considered masculine feminine. But to me, it was kind of like, guy's strong and heartful. He's worked hard to learn to play the guitar, and he's out there playing professionally. And he may not look like a football player, but his rendition, his expression of strength with heart is fine. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely fine as it is. And if we only have You have to be really sweaty and you're masculine. And you're feminine. It's taking away the vast majority of human beings on this planet.
Right. And limiting human experience, I'd imagine, by relegating certain attributes to either territory, black and white thinking of masculine or feminine. It makes them seem so much more inaccessible. You give the example of crying. So I had a good cry recently. And if I were to tell myself that I only have access to that when I'm open to my feminine side, not only would I feel so distanced from a cathartic activity like that could be really necessary to express what I'm feeling, I could see that being, it seems like very dangerous thinking.
Well, it is. And you think about how much the message that comes out about boys, men, and crying. Big boys don't cry.
Right.
And I was thinking of Frankie Valli.
Right. Right.
Big boys don't cry. Like this. It's like, really? I've worked with a number of men who remember the first time when they fought back tears from some pain, being broken wrist or hurt feelings, and they felt like, I'm doing it. I'm doing my male thing. I'm developing that, and so the success itself ultimately leads to failure. Paradoxically, because then it cuts off a certain part of being human. And you think about just the nature of the psychobiology of it. Like, there's cortisol in tears, right? A stress hormone. So crying is actually one of nature's ways of helping us de-stress. And so to have that be wrong, like unmasculine, itself is actually cutting ourselves off from a core way that we, on some level, become resilient and deal with stressors, which is a major part of life, because you may have noticed stressors are here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it ain't like it's getting much easier on this planet.
And hasn't there's been studies conducted too, and one in particular I found revelatory because it seemed to speak to my own experience as a young boy. And I witnessed it too. I worked with children in several different jobs. And as you stated earlier, you'll often observe the behavior of the young women, and they're very relaxed. They tend to be sitting still. I've often seen many with their hands folded. They seem quite demure. You look at the boys and they're rolling around and they're wrestling and they're tugging at each other's hair, and it's like they're almost eating their own fists. And it's, in one point, somewhat animalistic, but also there's a tremendous amount of sensitivity taking place to one's surroundings. And so I have heard it said that young men, and this is pervasive into adulthood for older men, are so sensitive to the prospect of emotion and vulnerability because it strikes us as so much more intense to be facing it. I'm not sure if I'm phrasing that properly, but that we will seek to avoid it. But if it's actively encouraged from an outside faction, when it seems like it's so much more necessary to express it, to feel it, to work it out, it seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. There's a woman named Naomi Way who is a researcher in New York, and what she did was, or did and is doing, is longitudinal studies, meaning they studies that happen over time, where she interviewed boys from like 4 years old to 16, 17, and she found that the younger boys, unlike the images that are presented, that boys are made of girls are made of sugar and spice and everything nice, and boys are made of frogs and snails and puppy dog tails, kind of thing. The boys just want to push each other and be aggressive and and we have to control for that on some level. That actually they connect with each other quite vulnerably when they're younger. They share secrets, and her book is called Deep Secrets. And they actually are more vulnerable with each other and feel more connected, because vulnerability is really the artery through which connection occurs, or one of the major arteries through which it occurs. And at about the age of 7 or so, they start learning the boy box, which turns into the man box. And so they stop showing vulnerability because the vulnerability itself gets shamed. And lo and behold, they feel increasingly disconnected from the friends that they felt so close with earlier on. And so when she's interviewing this guy, well, yeah, Yeah, Bobby and I, because 11 years old, Bobby and I, we were closer when we were younger, but that's just the way it goes. We're just not as close as we used to be, but that's life. The
Yeah,
resi-
I can remember rather. I feel a bit ridiculous sharing this, which is revealing, but I can remember in second grade, it was common for us boys to lay in each other's lap and have another boy scratch our scalp. By fourth grade, you couldn't get any of the boys to admit this had ever happened. I remember a particularly sensitive guy I still know to this day. I remember going to him in fourth grade and commenting on that. Do you remember us doing this? And he would not cop to it whatsoever within 2 years. So I find that very interesting.
well, and it's also interesting that you felt a little odd
Yes.
saying something like that, and
Yes.
I appreciate you saying it. Just so you know, I think that like in these moments there where you feel some vulnerability, obviously,
Sure.
saying that to me, I want to encourage that. I think that when we're encouraged, to reveal what's true, then you don't have this shame embedding. You're like, okay, well, that's a human experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very important one, actually. So to me, it took some courage on your part, and part of just to say, I didn't say earlier, I really like to reframe the willingness to be aware of and express a vulnerability as courage, not as weakness.
Mm-hmm.
It really does take courage, to go against some of those cultural tides, that will tell you, oh, that's weak, that's wrong, that's
Mm-hmm.
it's unmasculine.
Mm-hmm.
To do that when actually, like, it's the second grade is freaking cool, man. You're connecting, with each other, you're being nurtured. And then it's like, oh, you're working with real boys, we're tough, I didn't do that. No, not me.
Right.
Right. Not you. Because part of that is that you actually disconnect, from yourself. Not only disconnecting from others, you disconnect from yourself. And I do think that disconnection is at the core of some of the male health issues, that we face. Why is it that boys and men kill themselves at 4 times the rate, of girls? Why do men die 5 to 6 to 7 years younger? Some I'm sure is biological, but I'm quite confident that some is quite psychological.
Mm-hmm.
Not taking care of oneself. I don't need help. I don't need to go to a doctor, and I can do it all on my own. Yeah, right. You can do it. I'm a strong individual. I'm the Lone Ranger. I'm Superman in my fortress of solitude. That's such a bad myth, and we have to really deconstruct those myths and really create more myths of connection, of affiliation, of community. That instead of this, I'm standing up against the bad guys myself kind of thing. No, you're not.
Yeah, I think to the example I provided, whereby us boys in the class would look over and see the girls doing that, and the simplistic connection we made was that must feel nice, and so we did it, and it felt nice. Now the ideal now would be to have a beautiful woman sitting above you doing that to you, but not to a second grader, because back then the girls still have cooties. And you talk about the boy box, and it strikes my mind that as that box and that compartmentalization takes over, and the notion of should and who a man is supposed to be and represent, as opposed to who they actually are and what they're feeling, this erosion can take place of the self. You lose touch with yourself, or as you talk about yourselves, your compositive selves. And then no wonder the suicide rate would skyrocket. What's left of you if you don't know who you are anymore? What's left worth preserving? And also, if you feel you don't have access to it, what's worth preserving at that point?
I hear you. I agree.
I'd love to hear more about Strength with Heart, your seminars, your men's group, because you touched on it briefly, but I'd imagine there's just been some really revelatory experiences for you there in what you're bringing to men and giving them access to more of their feelings and their inner selves.
I've been leading or facilitating weekly men's groups now for over 38 years.
Wow.
And so at one point I had 6 ongoing men's groups. And that's a while ago. That wasn't, it was too much for me at the time. But I've had 2 that have a composite of 74 years right now.
Remarkable.
Uh,
Remarkable.
Many guys come through these, and really the support and the focus is being human. It's not about being male per se. So being human and having the full range of possibilities. And I've had groups of people fought with each other, not physically, but early on wrestling matches, like really very intense things. I was younger, at the time, and maybe that was more. Maybe I had a little more testosterone and supported that more. Over time, the groups have shifted, and certainly in COVID land, have shifted even more. But the core of the premise, to me, has been around strength with heart, that you can be strong, as a being, and heartful. You can have your great capacities and your creativity, your access to effectiveness, to success, and be sensitive, to be aware of vulnerabilities, to be compassionate, to be relational. And really at the core of it is being relational and being seen and honored, beauty, warts, and all. And so my own personal focus and my professional focus has been to, on some level, give support to guys to be free to express different aspects of themselves. Now, some might say, "Wow, like you're gonna access, and you're supporting to support all different aspects of themselves. Like, what if they want to go out and kill someone? You're going to support that?" Well, my experience is that when guys are supported and accepted for who they are, again, beauty, warts, and all, they're not predisposed to go out and become violent. Violence is actually an expression of frustration. You want to talk about anger? Of extreme frustration that just has to break out, in some way. But the corollary to that is if there's actually room to express even hostilities. Like, I was so pissed off at my wife. I was so angry. Really, say more about that. Well, she just will not pay attention to me no matter what I do. And what do you do to try and get her to pay attention? I start yelling at her. Well, gee, I wonder why. What would it be like to be yelled at like that? What would it be like for you? Like, just unpacking and doing the emotional archaeology and seeing that actually underneath it all is an experience of kind of ineffectiveness, a weakness, not having the capacity to affect and create what you want. And it's that frustration that actually leads toward violence, be it physical or emotional violence. Mm-hmm. So from a strength with heart model, we're really looking at how do you kind of bring out and be aware of these different aspects of yourself and use those appropriately, within a particular context. And so, yeah, if you're playing a competitive sport, you want to bring out that aggression in you, as long as you're not purposely hurting someone else, but you're really going for winning, cool. That's an aspect of you. We're not going to shame that and go, there's something wrong with actually wanting to win. No, there isn't. That's a part. And then there's a part where you're with a friend and you feel hurt about something, and do you just get nasty and reactive to it, or are you willing to, number one, be aware of what happened, and number two, to express that in some way? I'll just tell you that for me, I had a recent example where I went away with my wife, and I went away with 2 couples, and the 2 guys from those other couples are 2 of my closest friends. And at one point on a hike, it was like the 2 of them were absolutely locked in, together. And I'm probably been closer with each of them, and it was kind of like I felt a part of me excluded, and I could feel an old part of me, be it from second grade or whatever, of like not feeling important enough, got activated, and I could just feel myself disappearing from there. And given who I am, and I really support this in my groups and in my work, I actually spoke to them about it a little bit later on and said that I really felt excluded. And, it's like I couldn't seem to have access to either of you. Were so locked in. And it just triggered, an old part. I just acknowledged that. And it was like the intimacy of intimacy. And it was like, they embrace that because the people I hang out with aren't going to be, oh, what's wrong with you? We're just talking with each other. That's not, those aren't the folks I'm going to be good friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were super cool with it and understood. And it was, and I released it. It was like I didn't have any shred of that I felt like left. It was done. But I can tell you that if I hadn't done that, there would have been some part of me that was hurt, angry, frustrated, felt wronged, and I would have been unrelational. And so what I've done in my group and in my work is really in some ways an expression of what I've been doing, personally, in my own life in terms of my own transformation, of supporting guys to say, it seems like you like such and such more than me. Like to say really difficult things that are very vulnerable to say, not because just it's cool to do it, but because it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Do that. And unless we actually start getting in touch with and reveal kind of those deeper dynamics, which are very human. They're not male or female. We all have these things that come up in a relationship. Do I matter? Do you like me? Am I capable? Am I lovable? These are core questions that human beings have, not just males. And to just honor that and say that's just part of being human. And how do we kind of be aware of and bring those into relationships so that we can create stronger relationships and recognize that that's part of being human. I mean, part of it that's been amazing to me is even with guys, who have been in years of therapy and reveal themselves to a therapist, getting in groups, when they, hear other guys say they have their doubts and these things, things that concern them or cause them to feel threatened. They're to some degree like, really?
Mm-hmm.
It's like this conspiracy of silence, even despite how much things have changed in gender dynamics over the last 40, 50 years. There's still, and we are still at such an early stage, of this evolution. It's pretty stark.
Yeah, something sprang to mind earlier, and it was the notion that some of the, I will just say, the deepest conversations I've ever had throughout my life, at least some of them have been with men. Now, it may have taken 10 years to cultivate such a relationship where I felt it was safe to do so, but it exists. You're so right that it exists just as readily for men as it does for women, this opportunity to come forward and express vulnerability, express doubt, express grief, express remorse, and even the shame that we feel. What I'm learning lately is to not internalize it, but to compartmentalize it and not project it onto another person. Because sometimes for me personally, it can become such a frustration that I'm trying to wield it outward in a series of circumstances. But that makes such perfect sense that, and I love what you say about a conspiracy of silence. So many men feel that they don't have that option. And I myself have been to several personal therapists, but I'd imagine that a group setting would make a significant difference.
That's huge. I mean, I had a guy come into my group very recently, a month and a half ago, who had been very much involved with mindfulness, and he's a licensed therapist himself, and being in the group for a very short period of time is kind of, I'm actually accepting myself more as a man. I'm feeling less shame, of myself as a man. Just hearing other people share their stories, within an open, supportive environment. It's kind of like, wow, you too. Maybe we could have instead of with women with the Me Too movement, we could have the You Too movement. Where you too, have that experience. See, it's born right here in this moment, Jarod.
Yeah.
You Too movement. I like it.
You should hashtag that immediately. That is Daniel Ellenberg's latest contribution to the dialogue is the You Too movement.
I want to say one other thing about groups. We were talking about the shame, the doubts, the insecurities, and all. It's not only about that. It's also about the beauty, the success, the self appreciations that are also important. It's like the connection is not only through revealing doubts and insecurities. That's important, but it's also we don't want to hide our gold, either. Hey, I had a great success, and be supported in that and congratulated and honored for that, because that's also part of connection. And we don't want to just have kind of a misery bonding, so to speak. We can bond in a multitude of different ways. Not only our doubts and insecurities, but also our strengths and accomplishments as well.
Definitely. Well, I have nothing else to approach you with today, but I've immensely enjoyed speaking with you, and you've certainly given me a lot to consider and walk away with, which I greatly appreciate. I also appreciate all that you do. I mean, this is pivotal and incredibly important work, and due to the nature of the vulnerability surrounding it, that someone has to step forward and be vulnerable first. Someone has to go first,
right.
And so few feel that they can or are willing to, or out of fear of rejection would refuse to do so. It means a great deal. And I'm sure you're changing so many lives and allowing men to open up in ways that are making the world a better place. There was actually one more thing I wanted to talk about. In another interview, you talked about your own journey regarding anger, and just the energy coming off of you as we've spoken is one that's very Zen-like, very relaxed. You mentioned Buddhism quite a bit, so I'm sure you're involved to an extent. But recovery, as I've been forced to embrace it in the wake of my own upheaval in my own life in the past year, strikes me as such a gradual process.
Absolutely.
In no way is it rooted in a lot of the instant gratification that exists in our society. I've been backsliding, and I've had to come back. There are regressions. There are dead ends. There are twists and turns. And where you sit today, what is though this will probably seem as a very open-ended question, what's your impression on recovery? Because we're evolving all the time and our impressions change.
Taste the music. I grew up with a super angry father. I called him a major rager. And I really saw that underneath it was a depth of vulnerability. I saw it later, but he died when I was 10 years old. He died at 49 years old. And I considered it suicide, even though he died of a heart attack. Because everything he did, or most things he did, were just so not health oriented, to put it mildly. So I grew up with internalizing a lot of that anger. So anger is incredibly familiar to me. Familiar family. I have a term I call it psychoosmosis. We take in these messages, information through the permeable membranes of the brain, and they coagulate and turn into different characteristics or characters inside. And so I'm pretty keenly aware of the part of me that can get pissed off, and still does. I'm not in any way saying I don't get angry. I definitely have this part that can trigger me to get angry. However, I metabolize it faster. I work with it faster. and I come to a place of balance much faster, than I used to. And I think that the theme of balance is a really important one versus steady state. Like, I never get angry. I have transformed all anger. Right? Really? You have? Wow. Huh. I had a guy come into one of my men's groups some years ago where he had transformed all anger, he thought. And guys poked at him. Really? You never get angry? Like, do you breathe? I mean,
Yeah.
seriously? So I think that the transformation, when I say the recovery is just around like accepting that anger arises, emotions arise, in the human condition, and to see those and to kind of really work with those rather than shame those or even embellish those. That's like, okay, you got angry. What's going on? And is there a more skillful thing that I can be doing? And if I haven't been skillful, and I can tell you I have been extremely unskillful in many relationships over many years, the willingness to, at a minimum, attempt to bridge the gap, to acknowledge that, Paul, I was off. Sorry about that. I got triggered. I just felt ignored, and it just activated this part of the reactive part of me. Sorry, you're on the other end of that. And let's talk about it, because maybe there was something that's relational that we need to kind of figure out. And so I think that at the core is a focus on relationship. If I'm too me-centric, then it's all about me. If I'm only looking at you and what you want, I'm not paying enough attention to myself. If I'm only seeing the two of us and I'm not seeing the bigger picture, i.e. other people in the group or larger organizations, I'm too isolated. Mm-hmm. So how do I open my field of vision and my frame of reference so that I'm honoring myself, my me, I'm honoring you, and I'm honoring we? So I look at it through the lens of me, you, we. And I think that the more that we actually expand to include and recognize that we are planetary citizens and do some really looking at how to be a better planetary citizen, which is not to subvert one's own desires, but to also recognize that sometimes your desires can be a little bit exaggerated and they can encroach on those of other people. And this is challenging with over 8 billion people on this planet, needless to say. I'll pause there.
I love the connection you made with recovery and stability as opposed to balance, because stability would imply that one is on solid ground, which we never are. It would be a delusion to whoever thinks they are, whereas balance would imply a continual effort to maintain balance, because you can fall one way or the other at any second if you lose your concentration.
Right.
Or if something comes and hits you upside the head, which life has a tendency to.
What's that Grateful Dead line? When life looks like easy street, there is danger at your door.
Yeah.
There's gonna be stuff that comes up in life. You think that you're gonna ever reach a point of equilibrium where you're not going to have issues come up, they're not going to be threats, there's not going to be difficulties, you are totally delusional. The issue isn't about not having stuff come up. It's about how quickly can we metabolize it and embrace that. Even life-threatening illnesses or losses of significant people. It's like, hello, that's part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to keep succumbing to that stuff, or are you going to be resilient in the face of unwanted stressors?
Absolutely. And the notion of stability would imply that you're not letting anything in, because it would shake you from that stability, to absorb it, to incorporate it, to express it. Whereas with balance, it's just like the wind hitting someone on a tightrope. You're going to have to roll with it and find a way to stay upright.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
I've so enjoyed. Go on.
I was going to say thank you for your presence and appreciate your openness, and I really support you on your journey. And I think that what you're doing is important. So yay for you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm only I'm only getting started, and I look at all you've accomplished and all you're embarking upon, and
Jarod,
I'm a great.
Take in the good.
I will.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm gonna.
Don't minimize yourself.
Okay.
This is good.
Thank you. Thank you. I will do also something that is considered particularly unmanly, and out of my appreciation for this conversation, I will blow you a kiss, as Soupy Sales often did. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your time. I really loved it. Thank you.
My pleasure.